Now we got slides up. All right, so I was planning to start out with just sort of, first of all, an introduction to the Clean Energy Siting team for those that might not be familiar. That's the team that I work on here at NYSERDA. We have a few other staff members, and like I was saying before, we're basically a catch-all for any type of support, questions, training needs that local governments might have with respect to clean energy development. When we're not able to answer a question, we'll do our best to do the research and try to figure it out. So nothing's really off limits. This slide here just sort of really high level touches on some of the things that the topics that we can offer support on. It's certainly not limited to that. So zoning and permitting, which I know is obviously like a number one concern if a community is thinking they might have a large scale project coming in. So that's always an option. We can also provide advice, and we have resources on property taxes and payment in lieu of taxes or pilot. We can help out, understanding the seeker process for dealing with solar. We have some resources surrounding municipal procurement. Doesn't cover every possible scenario, but they do exist. There, for example, we have a model RFP that communities can use if they're interested in procuring solar. Things like that, the unified solar permit, which I'm sure most folks are familiar with by now. We have resources around that, including the permit itself. And more recently, in the last couple of years, we developed sort of its sister permit for battery energy storage as well. All of this stuff is available on our website, a nice little short link right there. All the guidebooks that you see on the right-hand side are available for download. We're always happy to meet in person, walk folks through it, answer questions, even, drive out and meet in person, get on the phone, whatever, webinars, you name it, happy to do that. And we can also send out hard copies of those if that's preferred by folks too. They're digital, or we got hard copies, happy to mail them out. Just name, address, how many copies you want, and we'll get them out the door. It's just a little screenshot of the webpage. All of our contact information is on there. On the left-hand side, you can download all of the resources. So I'll skip right through that. And so for more of the actual presentation, if you will, I was just going to start at the high-level overview of like state policy and what's driving all of this stuff, just to get everyone on the same page. You might be familiar with it, but maybe not everyone is. We have, obviously, through the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, some of the most ambitious goals in the country, if not the most ambitious goals in the country. We're trying to reduce our greenhouse gases 40% by 2030 and 85% by 2050. It's a lot. One of the ways we're going to get there is by meeting other targets associated with it. It's like 70% renewable energy by 2030, which is in the very near future, just 9 short years away, really. And 100% zero emission electricity by 2040, which also doesn't seem to be all that far away at this point. That act also established the Climate Action Council, and I know there's a lot of meetings going on there and different subgroups trying to plan out a more detailed plan of attack, if you will, for meeting these goals. And it's worth noting, I think, that a lot of these goals we sort of had unofficially already, but what the act did was basically sign them into law. So now we have to meet our goals, not just try to meet them. It's a lot of pressure. A little bit more background. You can see on the left-hand side, the first circle there is just our currently operating renewables. It's the vast majority of it, 88%, is hydroelectric that's been around for a while. We've had that in New York for years. That's sort of unchanging. And just a couple little slivers of land-based wind and some distributed solar. When I say distributed solar, we're talking about anything under 5 megawatts. So like community solar, residential, small commercial, everything under 5 megawatts is what we refer to as distributed solar. It's typically tied to end users, either using it directly on site, or in the case of community solar, they're subscribing to a couple panels or, a subset of a solar farm that happens to be nearby, but that electricity being generated is tied to sort of an end user. Anything above that is typically utility scale and just being fed directly into the grid. So that's what we have operating right now, contracted and in the pipeline, getting ready to be built. You'll see it looks a little bit different. A lot of offshore wind. It's a lot easier to get big numbers with offshore wind because they're capable of generating a ton of electricity in a relatively small area. Distributed solar, got some more of that coming down the pike. Land-based wind, just like before, maybe those percentages are getting a little bit bigger. But one thing that is very different is the large scale solar. They're making up 28% of our pipeline. You're not seeing that in the current operating renewables. It's new, as we all know. It's coming in, and like you said before, a lot of towns don't know what to do with it. They're not prepared. So that's what our team is trying to do, is help everyone get prepared and understand what to expect and what laws make sense and how to navigate the process. So that gets us pretty close to our 70% goal, but there's still a missing 20% that we're going to be working on in the coming years to get us there. So really high level slide, just outlining the primary considerations the local governments would have with the primary technologies that you're going to see coming in: solar, wind, and energy storage. So for all of them, they're going to be thinking about what the appropriate locations for siting them are and how to zone accordingly for that, what the environmental impacts might be, what bulk and area standards might make sense, if any, how to deal with decommissioning when these systems reach the end of their useful life, how to deal with taxation of them or pilots, all of that stuff that applies across the board: solar, wind, energy storage. And then the technologies themselves also have some more unique considerations that maybe don't apply to all of them. So solar, the main considerations that we see folks bringing up are the visual or aesthetic impacts. Does it ruin the scenic beauty of the area in their eyes? And is it perhaps taking up some of their agricultural land, and what are the impacts of that? Wind similarly has some aesthetic impacts to consider, but also noise and shadow flicker considerations with that are not considerations with the other technology. And for energy storage, visual and aesthetic impacts, not really so much of a concern. They don't take up a ton of land. They're easy to screen. They look like any other building, really. But the main concerns there are fire safety and incident management training for local first responders and how to deal with them because they're new. And all of these things are, we have resources to address all of these issues and are, happy to help. It doesn't maybe get everyone 100% of the way there, but it's certainly helpful. Energy storage is probably the thing that folks are maybe least familiar with. It's relatively new. I mean, the technology, batteries have been around forever, but not being deployed at the scale that they are now. So just to tee up that that's happening now and more coming in the future, I just wanted to share this slide showing what we have going on across the state right now. So as of sort of around the end of last year, there were only 96 megawatts of installed capacity for energy storage, but this year under contract, we have 1,000 megawatts under contract. So it just goes to show the scale of how energy storage is ramping up, and it's important for communities to be prepared for that. One of the ways we're helping them get prepared is running an energy storage webinar series. Again, we're always happy to do the one-on-one stuff too, but I think this series has been great so far. We've already gone through the first 3 in the series. The third one was last night. So we've covered Energy Storage Systems 101, a whole session on fire safety, which was great. Last night was zoning and permitting, and upcoming we have decommissioning and taxation and assessments for those. So share it far and wide. The sessions that anyone missed were recorded. They're posted on our website, so they can always catch up that way. So worth pointing that out.
Hey, Jen, can you go back? I'm sorry, the slide before that one that showed the map. What are the 3 around Watertown? Or is this someplace that we can, is this a map that we can access?
I'm honestly, one of my colleagues gave me the map. I'm not sure where it's located. In fact, someone just emailed me today asking where they could find the map because they saw it last night. I'm not sure. I'd have to follow up with you on that. But there should be at least information in open data in New York where you can see what the projects are. The map itself, not positive. I'm happy to send it to you. And I don't know what those exact projects are off the top of my head.
I think it might be missing some too. I think there might, because I know of one in Clinton County that's not showing up.
It's entirely possible.
Yeah.
yeah, don't take that map as gospel or anything, but it's just a general indication of where they're popping up, and there's a lot. That's the takeaway there.
That's awesome. Thanks.
Yeah. And I know everyone's very interested in large scale solar and, you know, what to do about that, what's happening, what's going on. So I figured I'd throw a few in here to spotlight what I think folks might be interested in there. Happy to talk about Article 10. It was originally designed to handle conventional energy generation facilities, not necessarily renewables, and like projects would take years and years and years to try and get through that Article 10, the state level permitting process for large scale energy generating projects. So we don't have years to meet those goals that we went over on the earlier slides, right? So Article 10 has since been replaced as of April of last year with the new Office of Renewable Energy Siting, which was created as part of the Accelerated Renewable Energy Growth and Community Benefit Act back in April of 2020. The act also did a few other things to sort of push renewables on a faster track, if you will. So the first is creating ORES to replace Article 10, but specifically for renewable energy projects, getting them permitted in under a year or 6 months if the project's going to be sited on a brownfield or similar type of land like that. The second component is the Build Ready program, and I got a couple slides on that later too, which is basically making NYSERDA a renewable energy developer for the first time, but focusing on underutilized lands like brownfields, et cetera, that private developers maybe don't want to touch for one reason or another. So we'll start developing those projects like the Benson Mines one that we talked about earlier. And then finally, and I don't have as much information on this because I'm not as directly involved in it, but the State Power Grid Studying Program, just looking at our existing infrastructure, where it needs to be upgraded in order to accommodate all the renewables that'll be coming online, and perhaps where it needs to be expanded into new areas that would be good for renewables, but they're not currently able to connect to the grid because it costs $1 million a mile to build those kind of lines, and that's just cost prohibitive. So real high level overview of the Accelerated Renewable Energy Growth and Community Benefit Act there. And again, feel free to stop me at any time if I'm diving into stuff that doesn't seem as relevant or interesting, but I'll do a little overview of ORES and how that works. You may also hear it referred to as 94C. Like I said earlier, it's the state level permitting process for any new renewable energy project over 25 megawatts. Projects between 20 and 25 may opt in if they choose. Otherwise, anything under 25 megawatts would be permitted at the local level. And also existing projects that were in the early stages of Article 10, they can also choose to opt into ORES if they want a faster track. If you want some nice light reading material, you can read through all of the ORES regulations that are on their website. I do actually recommend at least skimming through them to see what sort of requirements are in there, even if you don't read every single word in detail, right? But basically, they outline the pre-application activities that need to take place prior to a developer submitting an application. So prior to that, 60 days minimum prior to submitting an application, developers are required to have a consultation with the host community. So the host community, there should be no surprises there. They should, know it's coming. So they must do that, and they must, I hit my mouse by accident. So they not only need to meet with the host municipality, but also with community members in a similar time frame. And of course, with their pre-application, they also need to submit draft environmental reports and things like that, talking about wildlife, wetlands, cultural resources, et cetera. The regs outline all of the permit application requirements and things they need to do, 25 detailed, lovely exhibits that need to be part of these applications. And another thing that's worth noting is it requires the applicants to provide funding that'll be available to host communities. That funding is $1,000 per megawatt, and 75% of it is reserved for local agencies, so the local governments, if you will. The other 25% can go to other local stakeholders like environmental groups and folks like that. And if you're going to
about that, Jen, I'm sorry. Yeah. So is that is it earmarked? Can it just be, they can do whatever the heck they want with it?
It's not they can do whatever the heck they want with it. I don't know what all of the like parameters around it are. I'd have to go back into the regulations myself, to be honest with you. But it's for the local governments to be able to participate in the ORES process, right? So they can hire consultants perhaps or lawyers to just help them, navigate the process and participate in it meaningfully. It will especially come into play if they don't like the project or think it conflicts with their local laws, to try to make those arguments. It's not just like a grant to go do something. Yeah, and so if you're gonna look through any part of the regulations, I would recommend taking a look through the details of the technology specific requirements that are in there. So there are setbacks, height, noise, all the things that you might find in a local law, but just at the state level, sort of the minimum requirements, where if the project meets the setback, height, noise, et cetera requirements, they'll get a permit. I think that's one of the nicest things about ORES, love it or hate it, you know what to expect, versus in Article 10, these things were not set out in advance. In ORES, you know what the setbacks and heights and all of that stuff is ahead of time. So there are no surprises there. The only thing that might change them is if the host community has a local law in the book that conflicts with those. ORES technically has the authority to override local laws that are unreasonably burdensome, but there's still a part of the process where the community can participate and, state that conflict with local laws.
I'm sorry, that specific thing is what came up, that language, from the one supervisor about the undue burden.
Yeah. And it's not, explicitly defined. It's just unreasonably burdensome is the language. Or Article 10 had similar language. So that part of it isn't really all that different. I know folks are, upset and feel like their local control is being taken away. So, which I completely understand where that comes from, but it's honestly not much different from Article 10, which was around for years prior to this too. So still a valid concern. It's just not new.
Okay.
So we created this slide to show the process of going through ORES and the points at which the municipality is involved, right? So like I said before, over in the application phase, in order for the application to be deemed complete, the applicant has to demonstrate that they've met with the community and consulted with them. And they'll have to outline any conflicts with local law ahead of time. And then there's a few other spots here where the municipality is directly involved. So they're obviously encouraged to participate in the 60-day public comment period. That's their chance to say, this does not comport with our local laws. What they can't do is just say, we don't like the project, so don't build it. There has to be some basis in the local law to have a leg to stand on here, which is why it's very important for all communities to adopt solar law. And again, on the top right-hand side there, you'll see the intervener funds that we were talking about before, $1,000 per megawatt, to make sure that the community can afford to participate in this process and make meaningful public comments. If the facility is not in compliance with local laws, there could be an adjudicatory process. It's not cut and dry how they decide whether or not that happens. At least I'm not sure, but it could happen, might not. It really depends probably on the scale of the conflict with the local law and how unreasonably burdensome it is. Like, just my personal opinion, don't quote me on this. If like a community adopted a local law that just completely banned solar, right? That's going to be unreasonably burdensome. I'd be very surprised if that warranted some sort of adjudicatory process, right? Because it's just so extreme. But somewhere in the middle, if they have an argument to make, it could happen. And like I said before, this whole process is going to happen in under 1 year. Within 1 year. from the time of application. So it's much faster than Article 10. And they're able to do that because of those, the regulations that are out. It's already pretty cut and dry what needs to be done. So you don't need to go back and forth for years and years to figure it out. Okay, so the second part of the act, we'll call it, is the Clean Energy Resources Development and Incentives Program, which you will almost never hear. We refer to it as Build Ready. Less of a mouthful and more indicative of what it's actually doing, I think. So what Build Ready is, for folks who are not familiar with it, it basically puts NYSERDA in the shoes of a private developer for the first time. We've never been in that position before, where our services have typically always been limited to technical assistance, like we were talking about earlier, or financial support and grants, things like that. But now we're going to be seeking out, and have been seeking out, underutilized lands across the state that might be good for renewable energy development, but for some issue that the private sector doesn't want to deal with. So maybe they don't want to deal with a brownfield cleanup or something like that. Our job is to find those sites, de-risk them, so deal with all of that upfront legwork to get the site ready to build, get them fully permitted, negotiate pilot or host community agreements with the communities, do everything that a private developer would normally do, but NYSERDA is doing it with our consultants on board. Take projects all the way through the permitting process. If they're a little bit smaller, NYSERDA would be an applicant to a local permitting process, just like anyone else would be. For the larger projects, NYSERDA will be an applicant to ORES, just like anyone else would be. Get the projects fully permitted, all the agreements signed, and then hand that package off to a private developer via auction for them to build, construct, and operate going forward. Brian Reed, the director of the Build Ready program, likes to pitch it as a community benefits program first and a renewable energy program second. So we are really focused on, with these projects, making sure that the community is not just accepting of the projects, but excited about them and directly benefiting in some way. So it's just a nice little graphic showing our intent to work together with the local governments and the landowners to build a project that everyone's happy with on lands that weren't being used for anything else. They might have been more of a liability, and now you can start generating some revenue in the municipality from them. So we all work together and then hand off everything we agree on to the private developer to just build, construct, and operate in accordance with whatever agreements have been signed and the permit conditions. This slide is just a nice, real high-level summary of how the program works. So NYSERDA would take on the design, permitting, all the pre-development work for the projects, like I said, and then auction it to a developer for construction and operation. And they are bound to execute on any previously negotiated host community agreements, pilot agreements, et cetera, that were already agreed upon. And we're not just going to walk away. We would remain not just available, but actively involved in supporting the community through the process. So we've already got 4 sites in the pipeline, at least that are far enough along that we feel comfortable talking about them publicly. So this is from the website right here. One of them is the St. Lawrence County Mine, which we're calling Benson Mines. So that's like the one that's definitely farthest along at this point. There's a little bit more information about each of the sites on the website too. And it's important to note that not only are we doing a top-down search, if you will, for sites across the state, getting lists of old brownfield sites and things like that and examining them on our end, there's a public, we want site recommendations from everyone also. So there's a site nomination form. It's pretty simple. Anyone can fill it out. It could be the municipality, it could be a private landowner, it can be, whoever. Just tell us about the good sites that are out there. And by good sites, I mean, it's brownfield, landfill, abandoned commercial and industrial property, something like that. Generally 65 acres or larger, not a hard cutoff, but we're not looking for tiny projects just yet. We can't handle it. It's still a brand new program. We need some big wins to get going. and generally flat or gently sloping terrain,
Is there anything else, Jen, in the criteria, like access to three-phase power or anything?
Well,
Your
that's
transmission
certainly
line?
a requirement for us, but we're not like expecting folks that are nominating sites to do that level of research. But when they nominate a site to us, that's the first thing we're going to do is say, okay, do we even have anywhere to interconnect this? Is the property good? So not just because the site's nominated doesn't going to mean we're going to push to take it all the way through the process. We might spend 5 minutes looking at it, call up the person who nominated and say, I'm sorry, this isn't going to work. Thank you, but here's why it's not going to work. Others, we might go through some weeks of, studies before we find out that it's going to fall off. It's really an iterative process. We've screened hundreds of sites already, and 4 are far enough along to announce them publicly.
Oh, wow. Across the state, you mean 4?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, wow.
Yep.
Is NYPA doing a similar program for smaller scale solar? Do you know?
NYPA always confuses me no matter how many times we've met with them. I have trouble keeping track of really what they're doing, but they definitely do develop projects. They handle some smaller ones, and we're trying to coordinate with them as best we can to make sure we're not duplicating work, but they don't have anything that they're doing that is exactly like Build Ready, purposely targeting these sites to do the development and turn it over to private developers. But it is something they've always been able to do.
Okay. We were approached about one of our municipal landfills, which would be too small for your program, but they expressed interest. I don't know how it was going to work, whether it would be who the developer would be, but does something recent I can look more into.
Yeah.
I've been getting a lot of those. We have an old landfill. Can we put solar on it? And they're not very big for small towns, right?
Yeah.
And that it would be helpful to have somebody besides an individual developer that we could go to and say, does this have legs to stand on? Should we pursue it? So.
Yeah, I mean, if a developer thinks they can do it, it's probably great. I mean, what else are you going to use your landfill for, right? If you don't trust that, the first person who comes to you is the right organization for the job, you can always put out a municipal RFP, which is one of those resources that we do have, and see how that goes and who bites and what the costs are and stuff. But we often recommend for municipalities to just lease the land and not try to be your own project manager for solar projects, and just sit back, collect the lease payments, and let the project do what it do. It's the simplest way to get some money out of it. And municipalities are not able to take advantage of like tax incentives associated with the projects, which is another reason you're typically better off just leasing the land and letting a developer operate the project. Possibly include a power purchase agreement if you're interested in getting the clean energy too, but sometimes they already have cheap NYPA power and that might not make sense. But the important thing is the renewable energy gets built, not necessarily, who it's going to, at least from our perspective anyway.
So they could add in a PPA. So that's something, because that comes up a lot.
I don't see any reason why not. I'm not the person who's an expert in how all the contracting and stuff like that works, but I don't see why we wouldn't be able to. Yeah. Especially for smaller ones.
Right.
So yeah, much like the map of the battery energy storage, the pipeline of large scale renewables looks pretty big also. If you remember, that's in the pipeline, that circle chart that I showed earlier, where large scale renewables were not in the current mix, but they're in the pipeline mix. It was like 27% of what's in the pipeline. That's what these are. These are all those larger than 5 megawatt solar installations that are being planned. There are 81 so far. We do an annual solicitation every year since 2017. It's going to keep going, doing it again this year. 81 so far, 70 solar, 6 of them have energy storage, 10 wind projects, 2 with energy storage, and there's 1 hydro repowering. And you can see you're not alone in getting some of those large scale renewable projects up in the North Country. They are all over the state, generally, of course, following where the large transmission lines are.
What's it mean for a hydro electric repowering?
So again, not an expert in that technology, but I assume it's an existing hydro facility that was reaching the end of its useful life. So they need funding to do some upgrades and keep it going. We don't want to lose that nice clean hydropower that we already have.
Right? We don't. That's another conversation we can have. How can we support our small hydro people?
Yeah.
Another webinar.
Yeah, probably. And that is not me. I don't know that we even have much going on right now as far as small hydro goes, if anything, to be honest with you. All right. So, in addition to pilot agreements and host community agreements that communities might want to negotiate if they're going to be hosting one of these large scale renewable energy projects in town. There's another new benefit, if you will, that popped up, also introduced in the Accelerated Renewable Energy Growth and Community Benefit Act, which is the host community benefit program. You may have heard about it somewhat recently. So basically, for any project over 25 megawatts, the developer is required to pay either $500 per megawatt for solar, $1,000 for wind, and it goes into reducing the residential customer electric bills in the host community, wherever they may be, just an even split across all residential utility accounts. So however big the project is, multiply it by $500 or $1,000 and divide it up amongst the electric bills every year for 10 years after the project's built.
And it doesn't, my question, which you answered, it does not replace or dip into a pilot or any other sort of agreement.
It should not, no.
That's cool.
The legislation for it was pretty clear on that. Now, policing that, it's tricky because pilots and HCAs are negotiated, right? So maybe the developer might try to say that they can't afford as much of a pilot or a host community agreement because of this new payment, but it's 100% intended to be in addition to, not replace.
Are you finding other communities are receiving this well? Like, is this in other areas? Are communities pretty excited about this?
I haven't heard anything negative from communities about this particular thing, honestly. What's not to like, really?
Yeah, right.
Some of them might think it's not going to do much. So, if they have a lot of residents and they'll only get like a small chunk taken off their bill, maybe they don't think it's so meaningful. But for some of the smaller towns that are hosting a big project, I think this could be very meaningful. So it'll vary. See how it goes. It's still pretty new. Okay, so some of the other sort of considerations around these things for local governments and, what we're available to help with: comp planning, land use regulations, taxation pilots, assessments, all of that stuff. Comp planning is important because if a community is going to adopt a solar law, for example, it must be in accordance with their comprehensive plan. So if they don't have one, or if it's outdated and did not include anything about, their plans for renewable energy, might be time to create one or update one. And we've gotten lots of requests for assistance on that. And we didn't have great guidance on it before, to be honest, but we've been working over the last, maybe 6 months or so on developing some guidance documents around that. We're hoping to publish them this summer, which is great. It'll include, suggested renewable energy goals and actionable items to include in comp planning. And it's also just a general guide for comp planning and how to go about the process of developing or amending one. So we're excited about that. And again, if a community is participating or is hosting a project that's going through the ORES process, if they're going to say this project does not comply with our local law, and the local law they adopted is not in accordance with their comprehensive plan, they're not going to be in a very good position to make that argument, right? So it's another reason it's all important. It all ties together. It gives folks a leg to stand on. Which is what the slide here is showing. The quote, Article 10 and ORES both have similar language to that effect. The quote on here is from the ORES regulations, Exhibit 3. And you maybe I'll just read it. It must include a statement as to whether any applicable local jurisdiction has adopted a comprehensive plan applicable to those lands where the facility is going to be going, and whether the facility is consistent with such comprehensive plan, and they have to provide a copy of it. So if one does not exist, again, community would have a hard time making an argument that the project does not comply with their local laws if they're not there. High level overview. I know we've touched on a lot of this already so far, but it's kind of handy to see it all in one place and how it differs for solar and wind and energy storage. For solar and wind, so renewable generation projects are actually generating energy under 25 megawatts permitted at the local level, greater than 25 megawatts permitted at the state level, either through Article 10 or ORES going forward. 20 to 25 megawatt projects can choose to be permitted at the state level and opt in rather than go through local permitting. So those pathways depend on the size of the project. For energy storage, it's a little bit different. If energy storage is paired or co-located with one of those large renewable energy generation projects, it will follow that permitting pathway. So if it's paired with one that's 25 megawatts or above, the energy storage will ride along through ORES, with the solar or wind project. For energy storage projects that are not paired with renewables, regardless of their size, they're permitted at the local level. So that's another great reason for folks to adopt not just solar law, but also a battery energy storage law, which we do have in our battery energy storage guidebook. Both of them have model laws. They're totally customizable. They're available in Word versions. Communities can do with them as they see fit. We have recommendations in there. They don't have to take them. If you change things maybe too much and make it extreme, it could be looked at as unreasonably burdensome. So we think the laws are like a nice starting point for a pretty reasonable solar and energy storage law. We are actually making some updates to the solar law as we speak. In fact, we just met a little bit about it this morning just to make sure that it's as up to date and useful for communities as possible. We're also adding a decent amount more guidance on solar and agriculture concerns. Not just guidance, like a whole new chapter in the guidebook for solar and ag, but also trying our best to incorporate some new features into the model law that we've heard from communities they want to help protect their ag land in a reasonable way without just totally blocking solar, right? So stay tuned. Those updates should also be coming out sometime this summer. That doesn't mean folks need to wait for them to come out to adopt a model law, but hopefully it'll be helpful. Real property tax law 487. So again, I assume a lot of folks are familiar, but for those who aren't, it provides by default a 15-year property tax exemption for the added value of renewable energy systems, right? It applies to all system sizes, residential to utility scale. It does not matter. Renewable energy, it's tax exempt by default unless the jurisdiction opts out. I think some have opted out because they want to tax those large projects or perhaps try and make it not feasible for them to be built. But when you do that, you're also opting out and fully taxing residential projects as well, which is maybe not the intent or was not the intent. So we typically recommend that jurisdictions do not opt out of RPTL 487 because it gives them more flexibility to stay opted in, because you can always negotiate a pilot agreement up to what the taxes would have been anyway, while letting your residential homeowners put solar on their roof without a penalty, right? And one thing that I was really excited about that happened in this year's budget process, there's some legislation in there that now, if you weren't familiar with it before, RPTL 487 had this 60-day notification requirement. It went like this. The developer says, hello, local government, we're planning to build a project in your town. It starts the 60-day clock ticking. If the local government doesn't respond and say, all right, we're interested in negotiating a pilot for the project, if they neglect to do that, the project rides tax-free and they no longer have the ability to force a pilot, which is not great. Most developers were not trying to take advantage of that quasi loophole, if you will, but we've heard from a couple towns where that did happen, which is not great. So what was included in the updated legislation in this recent round of the budget process this year says that if a local government adopts a pilot policy stating that they intend to negotiate pilots for any project that comes in, they don't have to worry about that 60-day notification window anymore. They're covered. So I think that's great. Protection for local governments. And the chart at the bottom here just sort of highlights why we recommend not opting out. Some of the reasons that folks state for opting out we want to generate more tax revenue. But it's like, okay, if you're going to try to fully tax it, you might not even have a project to tax, because if they can't afford it, they're not going to build it. And again, you can always negotiate pilots up to, but not exceeding what it would have been under full taxation anyway. So retaining that flexibility, I think, is good. And there's also concerns about allocations of the pilot dollars amongst the taxing jurisdictions. I know the town sometimes feels like they're getting the short end of the stick in how those dollars are divided up according to the predetermined tax rates. But you can make up for that by adding host community agreements on top of it that can get the town a bigger slice of the pie, if you will, on top of their default pilot cut, if that makes sense. So there are ways to make all of this work without just opting out completely. So pilots, again, these are not unique to clean energy. It's a common tool for incentivizing local development, although they're a great tool for clean energy. And jurisdictions that have not opted out, again, can directly negotiate pilot agreements themselves if they wish. Often we see them going through the IDA just outside of the RPTL 487 process altogether. So even if a community has opted out, the IDA can still negotiate a pilot if they'd like. And like it says on the bottom of the slide here, a well-negotiated pilot allows communities to enjoy the financial benefits of the project while also allowing the project to happen, right? Another interesting component that was included in the budget process this year, new legislation, is the Department of Tax and Finance creating a standardized tax assessment methodology. So even if communities do opt out and they're going to be fully taxing systems, there's now going to be a defined pathway for how to go about assessing them. This is another one of those where we've heard some communities perhaps a bit upset. They feel like this is taking away their assessor's authority to, assess projects as they see fit. But I've also heard over the years, lots of communities reaching out to us because the assessors don't know how to assess them and they need guidance. So any project over 1 megawatt, as soon as this guidance comes out, which should be around like late September, early October, somewhere in that time frame, any project over 1 megawatt is going to have to follow this standardized tax assessment model that Tax and Finance will be putting out, as well as the discount rate that they'll be publishing every year. And in the legislation, that discount rate is going to be subject to a 60-day public comment period, so folks can, have input on that. There was not a requirement for the appraisal model itself to be subject to public comment, but don't quote me on this, I'm fairly certain that Tax and Finance fully intends to put it out for public comment because it's the right thing to do. They're also consulting with the State Assessors Association, so it's not being done in a vacuum. If you want to read more about it, I noted the budget bill that it's included in on the bottom of the slide there. It's not really too much to read. So, and what's important about it is it needs to be the discounted cash flow approach versus how some folks have tried to assess these systems is just based on the cost to build them. And the value in a solar project or a wind project is not in the structures itself and how much it costs to put them on the ground. It's in the amount of money that you can make selling the electricity. And it can vary, the amount it takes to build can vary greatly. So that's just, it's not a great way to go about assessing the projects. The value is in how much money you can make, and that's what the discounted cash flow approach does. Oh my gosh, we're already at 1 o'clock. I talked about host community agreements a little bit already, but they can supplement pilots, allowing the town perhaps to get a little bit more financial benefit than they would under a pilot agreement. The way they're divvied up can just be in the form of additional revenue. Host community agreements are very flexible. If they want to do some sort of project in their town, like the host community agreement could make that project happen. Really nothing's out of the realm of consideration with these. Super flexible, can be negotiated. So that's all I had there. We actually I have a meeting starting at 1, but I'm happy to continue the conversation at some point. I'm guessing you have questions. I don't know.
Yeah, we can send you some questions by email, and maybe after we forward the presentation to others, we'll just compile a series of questions to send off your way. But I found that very helpful. Extremely
Good.
Thank you. So yeah.
And it was really just scratching the surface. So
I'm
we
sure.
have much longer presentations with a lot more detail. We can walk through the model laws and everything that's in them. And so when I was putting this together, I actually deleted a bunch so that we could fit into the time. But just know that there's more, and we'd be happy to do a training session on any of these topics if you're able to pull together people who want to tune in.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, we'll be in touch. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks very much, Jen
Yeah.
Thank you.
and Jen.